Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Arkan's Adversaries, the Lugnum Campaign, Calm Before the Storm, Part 2. This is the part 2 to our next installment in the Lugnum Adversaries campaign. If you have not watched part 1, I would recommend that you do that now. But even if you don't want to do that, you can pause on this recap of the last video and timeline. I'm going to go over some basic things for this, focusing upon the other factions we haven't talked about so far, namely the Lugnum Liberation Movement. Infuriated by the Spillway 9 massacre on the day of the Emperor's Ascension, this video focuses on what is happening about 5 days after, or on the 5th day since, that massacre. Now, the Lugnum Liberation Movement, or the Order of the Cobalt Butterfly, have managed a close victory at the ambush of the Pt.2 mineshaft, but on this day they will come up against significantly more forces, and some interesting things may just happen to occur within Hive Movis. Now, the main thing that we need to focus on with the responses and the rising problems for Hive Movis, we've already gone over quite a few, but keep in mind there was a notable absence of a certain auspex indication. Essentially, there was a indication of something, void ship size, that appeared upon the planet's orbital auspex and then disappeared once more, as if it had never been there. A disturbing anomaly that is usually written off, however in this case it is notable for showing up on multiple different auspexes for a short period of time before disappearing once more. Apart from that, the hives have managed to deal with this problem in different ways, but the biggest thing that we're focusing on here is the Lugnum Liberation Movement in its entirety. We're going to reveal some extra information about these guys and finally go into the origins of the quote-unquote Lugnum Liberation Movement, this uprising, as it were. And at their core, as many of you have rightly guessed, is a cult. A relatively small one, but a collection of mysterious core individuals who are the actual impetus and the weirdly organized element behind this uprising. We talked about before in the previous video how explosives had been pre-planted in certain areas. Some of these uprisers, or these agitators, were oddly devoted to the cause, willing to both instigate violence and to engage in violence in a way that the average hiver, even an angry miner, wouldn't be willing to do. And this core, this group, identifies themselves, though they have not been identified, as the cult of the frozen fly, or the cult of the ice fly. These are freakishly loyal individuals, and they are often heavily built, lifelong miners with incredibly powerful physiques. And, again, oddly loyal enough that even though they have remained in full hazmat mining gear for the entire period of this uprising so far, and it is notable that that is not normal amongst most miners. Most people do not like to be in full hazmat gear for a large period of time. Gas masks, chem shrouds, and in some cases oxygen bottles. They have an odd combination. They seem to be charismatic enough to exert control or to command others, and they are disciplined enough to stay down in the mine, deep underground, basically at all times so far. As far as any of the other individuals in the Lugnum Liberation Movement are concerned, these are simply deep core miners who are not as acclimated to coming back up above ground as the others. However, their disturbing discipline and their ability to command and also to influence and manipulate others within the movement and within the uprising in general marks them apart, along with their dour demeanor and their impressive size. Now, in terms of numbers, the Lugnum liberation movement is basically broken down into 4 categories. You have the actual cultists of the Frozen Fly, who only number about 400, and they are armed with the vast majority of the rifles taken from the Planetary Defense Forces, including some other long guns taken from individuals within the mine, etc. Now, this monopoly is not for no reason. These are the most disciplined troops, so to speak, at the disposal of the rebellion, and thus they are given some of the best weapons. Those who do not have access to rifles are equipped with very heavy mining weapons. As mentioned, these are incredibly well-built humans, definitely on par with the average Imperial Guardsman with their physique, and they're also quite well-toned, meaning that unlike a lot of their fellows who might be bulky but not as even or untrained in a certain way, these individuals are far more uniformly capable, and they're swinging around much more dangerous weaponry, more on par with something an Ogren would have in their hands than the average pissed-off miner. In addition to this mysterious core of enforcers and cultists, we have around 1,000 self-named liberators. These are mostly the abhumans from the mine, and mostly those who are actually loyal to these Frozen Fly cultists, whether they are close friends, willing collaborators, or conspirators. They have armed themselves, engaged in active conflict with the Planetary Defense Force, and proven themselves loyal to the cause, not willing to break and run or desert. These liberators, while they are mostly abhumans, also include lots of mine officers who have pistols, and many of these abhumans are wielding heavy melee weapons or regular melee weapons. A vast majority of this upper 1,400 of the cult's elite, quote-unquote, are still certainly below true PDF level, even though the Frozen Fly cultists are well armed and equipped, and they're quite disciplined. All of them lack the true military training that the PDF have. However, what they do have in many cases is slightly different, if not necessarily better or worse. Now, when it comes to actually worse, we have the 4,000 more generic liberators. These are individuals who have been deemed not so much die-hard loyalists to the cause, not friends of the Frozen Fly, but rather they are just individuals who are zealous enough and driven enough to stay on with the cause. And they are some of the most poorly armed, with a mix of scavenged weapons, and several of them are using large mining vehicles as improvised weaponry. So this group of generic liberators make up the majority of the actual soldiers, and a vast majority of them are not equipped with any tangible ranged weapons. Maybe some thrown rocks or boulders, or a couple of hurled weapons like daggers or axes or something of that nature, but those are few and far between, usually limited to individuals who were previously gangsters who were capable with such weapons. In addition to that, there are over 2 million still motivated rebels. Now, these are people who are not giving up and running away after the first couple of days. There has been some bleed off from the cult, some bleed off from the movement. Not everyone is involved with the cult. That's just limited to our 400 Frozen Fly cultists. But these 2 million are the ones who haven't bled off during that time period. Many have simply slipped back out of the mine and tried to make their way back into Hive Movis, either surrendering to the Planetary Defense Forces or mysteriously going missing as they try and escape the mine. But that still leaves millions of motivated rebels who are quite willing to do a sit-in or stay within the encampment for a long enough time that the higher-ups or whoever's organizing this movement will be able to deal with the government. Because, of course, remember, this was all about changing the way that things were. Better working conditions, better hours, more respect for the religious requirements of the loyal Imperials on Lugnum, specifically in Movis Hive. Now, even though it may not have been the most wholesome thing to begin with, it may have been instigated by these not so imperially loyal individuals, at least those 2 million consider themselves to be conscientious objectors to the acts which have been done so far. Many of them had been fed the false lie that it was the PDF who were both responsible for the food riots in the first place, intentionally trying to starve out the population, and were also responsible for the explosion at the mine. Even though some of those lies have been questioned, questioning the frozen fly cultists often results in you disappearing in the middle of the night. So, not really something that a large number of those 2 million have been able to do. Who is leading the Lugnum liberation movement? That is a genuine question. Technically, the discipline for the organization, law keeping, ensuring organization, dissemination of orders, etc., is coming from the Frozen Fly. Fairly easily picked out, as they have been underground for this entire time, and people done up in full black chem shrouds, constantly wearing gas masks and hazmat suits, as well as carrying around full-on PDF rifles, look much more authoritative than the average miner or their average rebel. Even the liberators don't boast nearly the physique and the implied capability, and of course intimidation, of their Frozen Fly cultist comparisons. However, who leads the Frozen Fly is completely unknown. Each of them looks much alike to one another. Tall, broad, and even the difference between male and female slightly blurred in many cases. Some of the liberators, however, seem to just be following orders from them. Others seem to know them by name. And this comes in with another really pressing question: how many of the liberators are actually cultists of the Frozen Fly? Because there's a rapid questioning as more and more people who question the cult or who go against them publicly or try and organize against them are pointed out by their fellow liberators to the enforcers, and then they are dragged away. So, it is questionable how many of those local liberators are actually collaborators with these disciplinarians, because they seem to know them by name, and the rest just seem to be following their orders implicitly. So, a question there as to who's actually in charge of this movement and what their goals are. Plans and locations. The big problem that the Lugnum Liberation Movement has at the moment is that they have many mouths to feed. It's been 2 days, and while there's lots of storage on site, very often to accommodate workers, they still do need shipments of food on a fairly regular basis in order to make the meager meals that are required to keep their men able to operate and work. Granted, they aren't working anymore, but they are still putting forth effort to protect the work camp and keep themselves ready for a conflict. They need to be at least relatively well fed. However, they have another problem. They have over 1,000 prisoners. Between those individuals who tried to directly strike out against the movement, the counter-revolutionaries, so to speak, who have been silenced and captured, or in some cases killed, they also have the police officers and the PDF troops who they captured and who are unwilling to join the revolutionary movement. Now, this totals well over 1,000 prisoners, many of whom are being kept out in the open in front of the mine, hunkered down in long lines and being watched over by the cult of the Frozen Fly directly. Now, the Frozen Fly, those cultists, have made their home directly in the mouth of Pt.2's mineshaft, and they have started to keep up defenses and organize the defenses of the rest of the LLM encampment. The next important thing, and really the key to their continued success, is they are in a desperate need of momentum. While the information has been conveyed back and forth between the Hive and the Liberation Movement, and then back to the Hive via Vox connection, there has been no actual resolution decided upon, and with the deployment of the PDF, it looks like violence might be very imminent. This is something that they want to avoid. They want to have either some sort of ground gained, aka political or diplomatic pressure, or, more likely, they want to make sure that they can be successful in whatever next engagement the enemy tries to foist upon them, so that there will be no interference and they won't lose out on the 2 million still motivated people who could theoretically be turned into soldiers. So, what does this encirclement look like? Of course, we have the Delta-2 Liberator encampment. We have our Cult of the Frozen Fly down here at the mine shaft. We have several groups of a couple thousand apiece. We have the True Liberator down by the Spoil Pits, covering the hardest terrain, as they are abhumans, and they're able to cover the largest post of land. On the second day after the Delta 2 ambush, 300,000 PDF troopers assemble in a wide ring around Delta 2. They call out for the rebels to give up and to surrender, and they outnumber the armed cultists by over 40 to 1. So, in terms of the entire armed section of the Liberator encampment, they are drastically outnumbered. But in comparison to the overall movement, those 2 million conscientious objector civilians are still massively outnumbering the 300,000 PDF troops. But it is more than enough of a difference to keep even the armed men deep within their holes and protecting themselves, not planning any offensives at the moment. But they also have a wide ring. They're not keeping a tight eye on them, and they're not posted up on every single cliff side and jockey side for fear that there might be perceived threat and the large number of Imperial prisoners might be killed. After a short time on that second day, hundreds of thousands of would-be rebels flee the mine in all directions. Like I said, we started out with 3 million men, workers, most of them, and most of them completely unaware of what was about to happen. The violence has soured a large portion of that population, and the appearance of these shadowy, sinister figures disappearing people and giving orders to the workers' leader groups has become even more distasteful, and with that, almost a third of the original movement basically cedes and decides to go directly over and flee to PDF lines. It seems to be a sudden rout or loss of confidence at seeing the PDF, as even some abhumans flee into the waiting ranks of the PDF's hands, with their arms up and without any weaponry. Now this of course is a great sign. What the PDF want is for their show of force, their massive group of soldiers, to be met by complete surrender. We made a mistake, this was a poor decision, we didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. They're hoping for a peaceful and quick resolution so that they can turn right around and go help with the purge of the gene stealers. And this is exactly the illusion that the cultists want to give them. They let a lot of people go, gladly and freely, instead of taking them prisoner. However, the remainder of the liberators have dug themselves into multiple buildings and earthwork positions all around the area. And as nightfall approaches on that 5th day, explosions can be heard from within the PDF camps, and the lines start stirring, as the PDF realize that this rout, this apparent loss of confidence, was actually just a method to get saboteurs into their ranks by twilight. And so many of those abhumans and quite a few of those more loyal liberators have snuck explosives from the mine. In most cases, it's the last of the explosives or what's left of the blasting charges that weren't used in that initial explosion. They have been snuck into areas of the PDF camps meant for civilians, and they have been detonated intentionally in a way to cause the maximum amount of damage to the PDF overall. This will have negative effects on the relationship between the liberators and the PDF, but it will also have a negative effect on morale, which was the chosen effect. Now, the Rubbleside Night March is what this battle is called, and it's a bit of a long and drawn-out one, going all the way from 6 p.m. in the afternoon, just before twilight, to almost midnight. At 6 p.m., those saboteurs, as mentioned, set off their explosives smuggled in with waves of refugees. They detonate these on PDF campsites, and they signal the start of an offensive. Essentially, these civilians, these essentially loyal liberators who had been posing as civilians, detonate these explosives when they have an inkling that the enemy is preparing for an attack. The PDF essentially have their surprise attack spoiled by this saboteur activity. And they still advance, however, they are in twilight, and in order to maintain their operational integrity, they fire up a whole bunch of flares. So at 6 p.m., it's still twilight, the evening is coming, the sun is at a high inclination, it's starting to get dark, but through the night sky, dozens of consistent red and white star flares start shining and dropping down through the sky as the PDF rush into the upper end of the Liberator encampment. Now, the upper end is the least reinforced, essentially. It is the place furthest from the mine. It only takes them about 10 minutes to get into real contact. The non-containing PDF force, aka the group that's not making that ring at the camps where the explosion went off, basically 4,000 troops push into the northern end of the mining town. Now, why so few of them? Well, two reasons. On the one hand, they now have a bunch of theoretical saboteurs that they're waiting for. They're waiting to get sorted out at their camp due to the explosions, which means that they can't spare all that many men. Basically, almost 500,000 of them defect to go and flee to the PDF. How many of those are actually traitors? The PDF have absolutely no idea, so they spare what they can at the moment, which is about 4,000 troops, which, by all rights, should probably be able to sweep away a disorganized rabble like they're expecting to find. They are met by a similar-sized force of liberators, both those loyal liberators and the less loyal liberators. Sorry, they are met by a majority of those lower-grade liberators who only have melee weapons. The more loyal ones are in the south by the spoil pits. My bad. So, what is the organization of the defenses around Pt.2's encampment? Well, you have a couple of things. On this end, you have the security checkpoint, denoted here. Again, each of these squares with the liberators in them represents about 1,000 men. Same thing for the PDF troops. And they break up fairly quickly, with 1,000 of them rushing the security checkpoint, and the other 3,000 going through oil processing 1 and 2, and then ending up heading towards the mineshaft itself. These earthworks that the liberators have constructed are relatively imperfect. They're not quite trenches, and they're not quite earthworks. They could be better described as large heaps of dirt, earth, and spoil with ditches in front and behind them. This provides effective cover, and in a vast majority of the cases, it forces the enemy to climb over them, which is kind of the point. The idea is that if you have enemies who have the massive range advantage on you, you want them to have to get close before they can fire their weaponry, and forcing the PDF to run over the ramparts, essentially, and engage you at medium to close range, gives these large group of melee-armed liberators, many of whom are Ogren strong, or, similar types of abhumans, or just very yoked-out miners, an opportunity to bash their faces in with mining tools and pickaxes. So, over the next roughly hour or so, from 6:11 to 7:10, the liberators are forced back, consolidating and fleeing from building complex to building complex. Some are slain in trying to surrender, while a majority of those 2 million civilians that had remained on the base are killed en masse. The PDF are well aware at this point that trying to take these people prisoner, whether they be gene stealers, whether they be saboteurs, whether they be anything whatsoever, is no longer an option. It's the middle of the night. These people have already proven to be a threat even when captured or when surrendering. They gun a vast majority of the civilians that they find down without a second thought. The remains of the group that was originally holding the first oil processing position ends up at the checkpoint above the mine ramp. This finally is the position at which they turn back the PDF with heavy losses, and repeated counterattacks finally, at around 7:10, force the PDF to halt. Now, that's not to say that they're forced to halt because of excessive anything. Essentially, what happens is that they're trying to get over several of these raised positions, and each time that they do, they're sacrificing a certain number of men to do so. And as the darkness gets more and more complete, and flares get less and less consistent, they are beginning to fight in the dark. And fighting in the dark against this type of enemy is way more dangerous than fighting in the daytime. They had assumed that this enemy would break and run fairly quickly, but between the civilians absolutely losing their minds and running all over the place, and between these seemingly much more disciplined and very, very aggressive miners coming to crush them at every single turn. Even though they're winning, their victories are costing them at any turn. For example, on the left side here at the security checkpoint, the the Delta Liberator defenders, they're holding a very simple trench line, but they're also holding a guardhouse. And as that first split off group of PDF troops surmounts the entirety of the frontal trench line, or the bunker line rather, they're met not only at the front by a group of charging miners, but also around the back, where a large portion of this mining group have completely circumnavigated the house and come around the edge of their line. The PDF are definitely able to defeat this group, and they certainly cut them down to size, but at the end of the day, they are unaware of how many more are out there. The communication between the PDF units is relatively poor. They essentially have one dude with a backpack Vox who has to shout out things to his commander in the middle of this hectic battle. So that group is basically split off immediately, and they have to go and resupply and go back to the others because they're not sure what they're facing up against in such a small number. On the other side of the battle, however, you can see that it's a much more consistent fight, almost a chessboard style fight. One unit goes in, pushes the first group of liberators out of oil processing. The first group of liberators back off to the back end of the berm, and then this unit of PDF is followed by a second, and then a third. This group of PDF push all the way over the berm and towards the second group of oil processing, and they manage to penetrate. They get through the defenses at several positions. However, at this point, they are no longer 3,000 fighting 1,000. They are now less than 3,000 fighting 3,000 plus. This secondary area, this secondary ore processing and the entrance to the mine, that backstop that's been organized with a bunch of earthworks, is far more numerous. And with this group as well freed up, the liberators are receiving more and more reinforcements from more and more directions. The battle is getting insanely chaotic, and by an hour into it, the PDF are simply too spread out and too confused as to what the hell they're doing here. There have been a couple of friendly fire incidents in the darkness, and with these enemies simply being able to identify them by their having rifles in the dark, the enemy is having a much easier time setting up ambushes and those counterattacks for them. The real straw that breaks the camel's back is when the first set of PDF troops attempt to retreat and break back into the ore processing facility, only to find their way barred by another massive group of liberators. With their theoretical retreat route cut off, they're forced to take a winding route back around ore processing and scramble back up the hills, in some cases actually being chased by some of these rebels. That's not to say that it isn't a brutal fight on both sides, though, and the blood toll on both ends is viciously high. The north end is an absolute charnel house, and what is even worse, a large portion, hell, even a majority of the actual casualties on this day are civilians. Of the 2 million, probably a solid 10 to 20,000 are killed in the crossfire as they get in the way of or accidentally interfere with active combat outside of the area where they are living at the moment. So, as a result of all this chaos and horrible nonsense that's occurring, by 7:15, the PDF halt for the night. They haven't found the prisoners that they were looking for, their own individuals, the captured PDF, any of the mine workers who have been taken prisoner, or any of the police officers who went missing. They haven't found them because they are further south. And not having any more steam to fight on in the dark with all these civilians running around, they pull back in good order. The retreat is well organized. They put up more flares, they set up gun lines retreating backwards, and any charging enemies that try and roll over their position or line are quickly checked by automatic autogun fire. And it doesn't take them long before they're finally back up and out of the conflict zone. And there's a few hours of blessed silence until 9:50. 9:50 comes, and two things occur. Two very odd things. There are a lot of PDF troops on the northern edge of the spoil pits for two reasons. One, they're there for observation of the mine itself to make sure that nothing horrible is being done there, like an active collapse attempt with explosives or anything of that nature. The other one is that these scout units of PDF troops are being used to oversee where the prisoners are. And even though they are aware of where they are also aware that the PDF couldn't get to them. So they have to keep their eyes on them throughout the night to make sure that the PDF don't need to rush in and rescue them from any retaliatory mass murder that is occurring. And that isn't happening. These two groups of scouts are fairly numerous, and they're observing fairly well into the night, firing up occasional flares, or just keeping checks with binoculars or other visual materials. However, these cliffs above the spoil pits are coming under attack by 950, and it's not by normal liberators. On one side, you have the loyal liberators who had come into some contact with the PDF that day and also come into contact with them during a reinforcement effort during this conflict. These loyal liberators, mostly including a lot of abhumans, many of whom are also leaders of the mine or leaders of the movement, friends of the cult, they are holding the spoil heaps, and they're covering areas of it using foxholes, gravel ditches, and earthworks. They hold on to it fairly well, and even during the day's assault force, though they hadn't seen a lot of combat, they had come into some conflict. However, that's not what attacks at 950. At 950, the PDF troops on the right side of the cliffs, not on the left side where the rest of those loyal liberators are fighting, come under attack by an absolute nightmare. The entirety of the Cult of the Frozen Fly flows silently out of the mine in rank and file, rifles glistening in the darkness, and mining weapons poking into the air. They silently creep almost 600 meters up the cliffs and crawl their way to where the PDF are beginning their shift change for their evening scouting. And they get rolled over by this massive wave of 400 cultists. Now again, the cultists are massively outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. There's almost 1,000 PDF troops in that one group of scouts, and yet it doesn't seem to matter. One of the interesting things that happens is that this assault force seems to be protecting something in their midst. There is a massive wedge of black uniformed chem-shrouded soldiers who are pushing directly into the scout unit, grinding themselves against PDF bayonets and autogun fire, willingly emptying their magazines in many cases first, and then slamming themselves into the enemy bodily in some cases, and they're doing everything in their power to try and keep the center of their formation protected. There are more than one instances during this horrible nighttime ambush or assault of PDF troopers realizing that the enemy is not so much trying to dodge out of the way or take cover, but rather they are willingly throwing themselves in front of bullets so that somebody else does not have to take that fire. Now this will cut down their numbers dramatically, but this midst of fanatic attacking is horrifying. Something, and I do mean something, is with them, is supporting them, encouraging them, and its thin, crackling voice is pushing them onward. Now, this 1,000 group attacked in the middle of the night with some shadowy creature and its psychotic, fanatic followers willingly attacking up a slope and heavily armed with their own type of weaponry, rapidly break. And though they expect to be pursued through the night by this shadowy creature and its group of evil goons, well, they aren't. What they do realize is that outside of the dead who they find the next morning, there are over 100 of their own number seemingly taken alive. This attack, this spoiling attack, this assault, this odd move really was seemingly done to grab more prisoners. What is also equally disturbing is that none of those chem-shrouded frozen fly cultists seem to be among the dead. Whether they're dragged off or they manage to drag their wounded carcasses back down the spoil pits is unclear, but it is very clear that not a single cultist corpse remains after the battle, while over 100 of the living PDF troops are hauled back down into the mine. What is even seemingly worse than this sudden show of violence and aggression and disturbing psychological warfare is that at 11 o'clock, that disturbing aspects and the terror of the night assault are going to get even worse. A shadow appears overhead. Above this flare-ridden, terror-stricken battlefield, several small, red-colored, dark Eldar venoms are flying and observing the carnage. Cabalites and various other individuals are simply watching as the battle unfolds, their night vision allowing them to see what literally no one else on this battlefield, other than the Nightsiders, is able to. These are gladiatorial hunters. They are members of the Red Grief witch cult, and they've locked onto the panic, then the silence of Movis's astropaths. Essentially, these dark Eldar raiders who are out looking for sport, spoil, and slaves caught on to the fact that, oh, an Imperial world in trouble. When their astropaths start screaming and then they go silent, that usually indicates fertile hunting grounds. And they interpret this distress, of course. After some observation, they selected the mines as the best hunting grounds. In some cases, that's because of the connection between the hive and the actual mines. That Vox connection, as mentioned previously, has been detected by the Dark Eldar, and it's been monitored at least for the day, allowing them to identify that these are indeed rebels against the Imperium. And oh, how sweet that term sounds to a blood-hungry Drukhari. The idea of these individuals being enshrouded or completely encircled by an opponent, desperate, and of course perhaps quite willing to deal with non-Imperial forces, is more than enough to pique their interest. However, when they're observing the actual battle that they see that day, they see something of much more value. The day's vicious melee combat, along with the Liberators' many prisoners. Now, not only do many of the Liberators show extreme levels of self-destructive, almost courage, charging at armed enemies with melee weapons, whether they are mad or simply well-driven or misguided, or in some cases fanatically loyal, it doesn't seem to matter to the Drukhari. They saw some impressive throwing down, and they see some prisoners that might be taken off of the hands of these individuals. So as the evening darkens and the last raid up the cliffs is completed, these Dark Eldar drop from the sky from their 3 small red-colored venoms. They land relatively peacefully and walk up to the Monkai, offering them the average deal that the Dark Eldar would offer to a seditious element within the Imperium. So, on that note, what happens next? Technically, the encirclement of Pt.2 is a tactical Imperial victory. They organize and manage to break off large portions of the cult simply by showing up and telling the rebels that they're allowed to come out and not get murdered immediately. However, the Rebel Side Night March is a heroic victory for the Lugnum Liberation Movement. A brutal night-fighting battle where horribly outnumbered and outmatched rebel forces managed to cut down and force the PDF to retreat through a mix of chaotic strategy and absolutely having no regard for civilian life. The cherry on the top of the Night March is the fact that the most powerful and elite units, the cultists and the loyal Liberators, were basically untouched by the PDF. They had a few close run-ins, and even with the raid, it's not clear how many of the cultists actually died. So, of course, with their hauling their bodies back, who knows how many of them are out there, who knows how many of them are still in the mine. It's very unclear. So in any case, a heroic victory. Even with the severe casualties that they took, we still have a great, great win for the overall movement. And that is where we go into you guys. There are sisters in peril within the Hive, sisters of battle who are cut down to size during our last video in part 1. The PDF, the remainder of the Cull forces, what's left of the Arbites of the PDF, have been cut down dramatically in size. They've been defeated 2 times already, and suffered casualties out here in the mine as well. And then on the external, we have this stalemate and this seemingly disturbing meeting between unnatural forces and foreign Xenos creatures trying to work out a deal with the rebels. The hive is under extreme stress and strain. What decisions can be made now? Well, that's up to you guys, as it is up to you during our vote to decide what happens in our next video. I'll be going over several different things, giving you maybe 3 or 4 different votes at this point. So, I wish you all... Oh, sorry. Don't do the intro just yet. I want, of course, your input on the next campaign, any comments that you have, details that you'd like to ask for. I know I've left a lot of things unsaid for this video. It was supposed to be a setup for bigger things, so don't worry, bigger things do be coming. But with that, I really hope that you guys give me your votes. I would like some comments, if I could, because I know lots of things confusing. I'm very happy to fill you in on that. And feel free to subscribe. We are so close to that 500 mark. I am very excited to see you all, so happy to see you here as part of this community. Our Discord's popping off. All the votes are doing great. The videos are doing incredibly well. You guys are so fast and dedicated. You have no idea how much it means to me, how much it encourages me to keep doing these. So, I have some more videos coming up. Of course, the votes will also be for that, but the week votes will come in as well. And I will wish you all a lovely good night.